Hello and welcome back to Analysis. Have American doctors helped the US military to design methods of torture? A fortnight ago, the New York-based Institute on Medicine as a Profession produced a report that claimed that there has been collusion between US doctors and the US military in sites like Guantanamo Bay and elsewhere. The report stated that medical professionals had participated in and had been complicit to the torture and cruel, inhumane and degrading treatment of those detained. Both the CIA and the Pentagon have rejected the report outright, with one spokesman describing the allegations in the report as utterly absurd. But many human rights organizations feel that this report uncovers the depth of pressure that the American military and intelligence organizations exert to extract information from those detained. And many feel that this report shows a moral and ethical line has been crossed. Almost 5 years after President Obama declared his intention to close Guantanamo Bay, will this report have any influence in the case to close it? Joining me to discuss this are Daniel Viesnik of the London Guantanamo Campaign, Polly Rosendale, Deputy Director of the human rights organization Reprieve, and Makbool Javaid, spokesperson for Cagepersons. We'll discuss this with them in a moment, but let's first see Emmanuel Nunes has more.
It took 2 years of research and investigation, and the conclusions are shocking. Doctors aided torture at US military prisons. After 9/11, American military physicians, psychiatrists and psychologists allowed cruel and inhumane treatment of prisoners. The report made by the Task Force on Preserving Medical Professionalism in National Security Detention Centers suggests that doctors advise the military on how to best deploy waterboarding, sleep deprivation and sensory overloading. Their goal was to get information out of terrorist suspects at Guantanamo Bay. The 19-man panel also says that the Department of Defense and the CIA ordered doctors to engage in abusive interrogation techniques. The report, compiled by an independent panel of military, health, ethics and legal experts, also says some detainees were consulted on conditions of confinement to increase their disorientation and anxiety. Days after being sworn into office, President Obama declared his intentions to close Guantanamo Bay prison. His words still echoes in many people's heads.
And promptly to close the detention facility at Guantanamo consistent with the national security and foreign policy interests of the United States and the interests of justice, I hereby order. And we then provide the process whereby Guantanamo will be closed no later than 1 year from now.
But in reality, the prison is still open, despite protests all over the world, like this one in London.
People don't care. For instance, a lot of Americans actually think it's closed because Obama promised to close it as soon as he took office. And when he didn't make that deadline, he kind of just tiptoed over that fact rather than raising awareness like he did when he said he'd close it. And people honestly believe that it's serving a purpose without knowing the facts behind Guantanamo Bay.
I think that people should be campaigning for people who live near them, who have been imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay. I think that they should pressure their government actually into taking strong action, actually to come out against as even stronger than they have done, because it's not been good enough so far. And I think that they've been extremely weak, and they are kowtowing to what the American government are saying.
After another scandal regarding US military prisons, when can we expect a final decision on Guantanamo prison? Will there ever be any accountability for this potential complicity between doctors and the American military?
Well, let me come to you, Polly, to start with. I mean, there's a hunger strike going on in Guantanamo, isn't there? How many people are still on that, and are they being force-fed?
The latest figures of the numbers of detainees who are being force-fed are 15. We should bear in mind that those are Pentagon-released figures. Even at the height of the hunger strike, this year's hunger strike, when we thought there were about 100 men who were on hunger strike at the time, the Pentagon substantially underestimated. So we need to take it all with a bit of pinch of salt.
And what happened to the ones who were on hunger strike who aren't anymore? They decided to give up, or what happened?
Well, the US military response to the hunger strike was quite brutal, and there was severe pressure on the men to break that strike. Number of tactics such as forced genital searches for men who were going to take legal calls or family calls, interference with their right to communal prayer. So eventually, yes, a number of men did break.
Well, let me come on to you, Daniel. I mean, the force feeding, I mean, doctors are taking part in that, or is it just prison personnel who are not medical?
No, it's definitely doctors and other healthcare professionals who are very much involved in that, and they're actively involved in very painful and coercive procedures. It's force feeding, so it's obviously without the consent of the detainees, and the use of restraint chairs. The use of using very wide bore tubes forced into the stomach, which is a very painful process, and in addition the forced administration of medications such as metoclopramide to stop the patients from vomiting, which itself has quite serious adverse effects potentially, and all of this is against the ethics of medical and other healthcare professionals, and yet they're required to do it, and they go along with it.
But if there is force feeding, isn't it better that a doctor is there than that there isn't a doctor? At least
well, it is, but they shouldn't be complicit in feeding people against their force feeding detainees against their will. The World Medical Association has spoken out against it and has categorically declared that this is an unethical practice. So it's not something which they should be involved in.
But doctors, I mean, in prison, there's a so-called suicide watch against prisoners, or on prisoners, to try and prevent people committing suicide. I mean, a hunger strike is a sort of slow-motion suicide, isn't it? So isn't it right that the prison authorities should try and prevent that happening?
Well, then it would need to be done on a case-by-case basis based on a medical assessment, but that's not what's happening. It's being used as a routine measure to break the hunger strike. It's being used for political purposes, essentially. So it's not based on medical need at all.
I think if I may just come in, I mean, let's be clear, hunger strike is a peaceful protest. It's not an act of suicidal intention.
But sometimes it goes as far as death, doesn't it?
It may go as far as death, but if, as Daniel says, there's an assessment that the individual is competent to make that decision, then the World Medical Association deem that it's inhumane to force feed someone in those conditions.
In all circumstances?
Force feeding of a competent individual who is hunger striking constitutes inhumane treatment.
I mean, the other thing, obviously, that we saw in the clip was, interrogation of detainees in humiliating positions, the Abu Ghraib photographs. That's obviously quite different. Can there be any justification for doctors taking part in something like that, or giving advice to the warders, the prison guards and so on, prison authorities?
I mean, definitely not in terms of, giving advice in terms of how, particularly with the alarming to read in the report about the role of the psychologists in actually designing, and psychiatrists in designing the programs and advising interrogators on how they can more effectively break down the will of the people being interrogated, and that's completely unethical. There may be a role in terms of aftercare for somebody who has been subjected to torture and abusive treatment. Then obviously there's an ethical responsibility for healthcare professionals then to deal with that, but they shouldn't be actively complicit in the actual process itself.
Have any doctors actually resigned or protested publicly and said they're going to stop taking part, or they refuse to take part?
I mean, I don't know about the actual doctors who are involved in it, but certainly many doctors around the world and medical associations have spoken out against it and have deemed it to be an unethical practice which should not take place. And it comes, I mean, the practice comes at the highest level, from the policy, from the government, from the Department of Defense, and from the CIA leadership. But at the same time, just because they sanction something as, in their view, being legally acceptable, that doesn't mean that it's ethically acceptable from a professional point of view. And so there's also individual responsibility for those healthcare professionals that are involved in these practices, and they need to be held to account, as well as the policymakers.
I mean, I think the report makes the point that the health professionals were described as safety officers, which gives the impression that they're there in order to look after the health of the prisoners. But in fact, what the report has made clear is that they were actually involved, facilitated the torture, the enhanced interrogation techniques that were implemented. For example, we all know that there is a duty of confidentiality between a patient and a medical professional, a doctor. You will share information, very private information about your health, and the duty is to maintain that confidentiality. What the report makes clear is that information was used in order to break that individual. So the very foundation of the relationship between a doctor and his or her patient was breached. Secondly, the report makes clear that simply because you wear a uniform, it does not mean that the ethics and principles which guide health professionals are abrogated. The conditions ought not to make any difference. You have a duty not to cause any harm. You have a duty to ensure that the safety of your patient is paramount. That was not happening, and as both my colleagues have pointed out, the World Medical Association, the American Medical Association guidelines are very clear that this type of behavior, where you are complicit, where you are facilitating torture, where you are creating pain, breaching confidentiality, is not acceptable.
Well, has the AMA, the American Medical Association, gone as far as to say we will strike off the register doctors who take part in this because they've violated their professional ethics?
What has happened is attempts have been made by individuals to take action against doctors that they have known that were involved in this practice, and it's gone before the disciplinary committee on a few occasions. And those attempts have not always been successful because you have to understand that these individuals may be coerced. They're in a situation where enormous pressure is put on them to facilitate the sort of torture that is taking place. And if you're in that situation, you can justify all kinds of actions. You're in a very difficult environment. You're treating people who are described as the worst of the worst. These are the enemies of the United States, enemies of the free world. They're barbarians. They're dehumanized. And in those circumstances, you may behave in a way which you otherwise would not.
But if that is their defense, that we were coerced, then surely the logical conclusion after the end of the case is to say, I'm not going to continue doing it anymore because I don't want to be coerced anymore. I'll find another way to practice my medical profession.
When you are employed by the military, and the CIA had their own medical staff as well, it's very difficult. They can't make those dispassionate decisions that we would otherwise think that people would make. They haven't been able to do that. And maybe, as has happened with the military, when they have left, they have blown the whistle, they have talked about the malpractice, and I am sure in time people will come out and they will reflect and they will say that what we were forced to do was completely unacceptable. But at this moment in time, that isn't happening. And I think one has to bear in mind the fact that there are fundamental principles that cannot be breached, and that is what is happening here.
Well, maybe they're the people who gave information for the report. I mean, does the report make clear what their sources are? I mean, the CIA and the Pentagon say it's utterly absurd, it's nonsense, but it must be fairly reliable. What's it based on?
It's based on
public source documents,
public source documents, not individual doctors like the ones we're talking about who stopped working at Guantanamo Bay and now come out and been whistleblowers, basically.
Although there are a number of task force members who are medical professionals who have security clearance and have experience of working in Guantanamo.
And have experience what?
Who have experience working in Guantanamo, who have security clearance necessary.
So they could be some of the sources, maybe.
I think they're very clear that they have not blurred their, there's no conflict of interest between their experience working in Guantanamo. They have relied only on public source documents. nevertheless, there's obviously a considerable body of expertise behind them, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, they're in a way, in between a rock and a hard place, in the sense that if they were to say, well, X, whose identity they revealed, was put through X, Y, Z, and this is what happened to that particular person, then they're breaching confidentiality as well. So it's very difficult. Plus the fact that, there's enormous political pressure. Given the fact that the large proportion of the American public seem to think that, Guantanamo is housing these very dangerous individuals who can never be released, and there is enormous sort of justification by politicians and the media, it's difficult to come out. You need to be enormously courageous. But I think we all accept, do we not? And maybe this is, one may consider this to be dramatic, the Nuremberg principle, which is you can never justify actions which are inhumane or unlawful on the basis that you were ordered to do so.
How much evidence do we have on the psychology issue that you mentioned, in helping prisoners, helping prison guards torture people better, as it were, and deal with the psychological issues? I mean, do we know that a lot of psychologists were hired by the military, or?
I don't know the number involved, but all in the report it talks a lot about the active involvement of psychologists and psychiatrists in the designing and in advising during the interrogation processes. And that's all based on information that's been declassified, and it's public record information. So all of the information they're using in that report is public record, which means there's probably a lot more involvement that we don't know about, or that people know about, but it's not been declassified. Therefore, they're not talking about that. So this could well be the tip of the iceberg. But it seems that the psychologists have been very extensively involved, and it's quite alarming to see it. It's one thing when it's the politicians and soldiers or interrogators that are doing it, but when you know that there are healthcare professionals who have taken oaths that are very much actively playing a part in the process, it's really quite disturbing. And it also erodes trust in the healthcare profession.
I think that's absolutely right. There is clearly no trust between detainees and healthcare professionals in Guantanamo at the moment. Some of this is not new. We've actually known about this for a number of years. There are reports that came out, published by Physicians for Human Rights several years ago, which documented exactly the same or very similar evidence of complicity by psychologists, and they were based on interviews of former detainees who had been released from Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, amongst other places. And it's certainly something that Reprieve is familiar with from our work, both with men who are still detained there and men who've been released. One of the things we hear over and over again from our clients is that there is absolutely, they have no trust in the doctors whom they are obliged to see for treatment. We have a Yemeni client, Imad Hassan, who met with our director Clive Stafford Smith a few weeks ago in Guantanamo, and he recalled that when he was a young man in Yemen, he thought they called nurses angels of mercy. Now he sees them as angels of death. So terrified is he of going to what he calls the torture chair, which is the chair he's strapped into twice a day, shackled at the ankles, strapped at the head, and with a nasogastric tube placed in his esophagus. This is no way for healthcare professionals to be behaving.
What about this comment, Makbool, that Leonard Rubinstein, who's one of the co-authors of the report, says that the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, and the CIA actually changed core ethical standards to facilitate participation by health professionals in the abuse of detainees? I mean, they actually changed the rules to...
Oh, yes, you've got to, in order to be able to allow the healthcare professionals to be involved, you have to sort of persuade them and convince them that this is ethically permissible. Otherwise, one would assume that they wouldn't participate. So you've got to create that acceptance and that environment. And once you've done that, then they become complicit. I mean, we were talking about psychological techniques. It shouldn't surprise us. You need to have certain cultural information. These people are Muslims. There are certain issues that are sensitive to them, so that bringing in dogs is going to, culturally, will be significant. You know, desecrating the Quran, not allowing them to engage in communal worship, not allowing them to perform the ablutions, refusing them water. You need to have cultural information to know what will affect this individual, what is going to create trauma for him, what fear, you know, use of sexual humiliation. That is particularly sensitive for individuals from the backgrounds that the detainees come from. And then the general psychological techniques of sleep deprivation, loud music, you know, all these enhanced sort of interrogation techniques, waterboarding that we know about, which has been admitted. It's never been denied. And the CIA say, well, we're not doing this anymore, but the report says that these techniques are still being used. So there is an admission there that these things were being done. Because
well, I mean, the sort of the bottom line, obviously, is whether Guantanamo Bay is going to be closed. I mean, we're sitting here discussing this on TV, but the report came out a fortnight ago. Has there been much public sort of discussion of it on American TV, you know, which is really the place that it needs to be?
No, I think sadly Guantanamo has dropped off the radar in many of the minds of the American public. We are approaching the 12th anniversary in January of Guantanamo opening. We're in a situation where more than half of the men have been cleared for release. The hunger strike did raise the profile of the prison once again, and Obama recommitted to closing the prison in May this year.
Oh, he publicly said that?
He publicly said that.
But that's
in
May.
a major
so
speech in national security.
He's passed the deadline.
Absolutely. Since then, he's managed to release 2 men, which we're obviously delighted about. It's the first time that such transfers have happened in a good number of years, but that is clearly far too slow.
What is the main reason why the ones who've been cleared by the authorities of any terrorism issues, why aren't they released?
Basically, Obama is actually failing to use his executive power. He blames Congress. There's a piece of legislation that's been through Congress the last few years called the National Defense Authorization Act, which places restrictions on transfers out of Guantanamo. It's true, it makes things more difficult for him. What is not true is that it makes it impossible, and as demonstrated by the fact that he has transferred a number of men in the last couple of years.
To where?
The 2 men who were released in August this year were sent to Algeria.
Right. But none of them ever are freed in the United States. They're always deported, basically. When you say transfer, it means deport.
It either means repatriated, or it means they're resettled in a third country. If they can't return to their own country because of risk of torture or other kinds of persecution, then they look for a third country where they can be resettled.
I mean, the climate in the United States at the moment is very, very difficult with the Snowden sort of allegations that have come out. The fact that you know, the NSA were eavesdropping and hacking into all this sort of emails and phones all across the world. It's created this sort of narrative that there's the enemy within. Whistleblowers are seen as
if
traitors.
Countries don't want to take these people, that is, you know, they've got to be released somewhere. They can't just be sent into space. If the countries don't take them, they're as much to blame as Obama, surely.
Well, we have Shakarama here in the UK, where Prime Minister Cameron has actually publicly asked President Obama at the G8 summit to transfer Shaka back to his family in Wandsworth, and yet there's no movement.
Once you've created this idea that these are the worst of the worst, and we kept them for nearly 12 years because you know, they couldn't be released, and then you investigate and find out that actually they aren't who you describe to the world as being.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut it short. I just hope that we don't have to talk about Guantanamo much longer, because it has to be closed. Thank you very much, Polly Rosendale, Daniel Viesnik and Makbool Javaid. And thank you for watching.